On Christmas Day, my daughter called and told me not to come because her husband's family was upper class and they said I wasn't on their level. I didn't argue. I just hung up and went back to my office. A few days later, her billionaire father-in-law and my son-in-law came to my company to negotiate a big contract. They walked into the meeting room. They saw the Forbes magazine cover, then looked at me. Their faces turned pale when they realized that the father they had tried to push out of the family because they thought I wasn't on their level was the very CEO they had been pursuing for months. I truly appreciate you being here. Before we continue, take a moment to comment where you're watching from your city or country. It helps connect everyone here. Please note, parts of this story may include fictional elements for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real people or places is coincidental, but the message shared may still resonate with you. The snow started falling sometime around 8, the kind of slow and quiet snowfall that Lake Michigan seems to pull out of the sky on Christmas Eve, like it's been saving it all year, just for this. I was sitting alone in my office on the 42nd floor. The city lights below me blurred soft and golden through the glass. And I was doing what I always do on this particular night. Not much of anything, really. A little paperwork, a little whiskey, a lot of staring at the dark water in the distance. I have never been able to explain why I come to the office on Christmas Eve instead of going home. The apartment is nicer objectively, warmer, but there's something about this room at this hour on this particular night that I find I can't leave behind. Maybe it's the height of it, the way the city looks from up here when the snow is falling, and the whole grid of it goes soft at the edges. Maybe it's just habit. 22 years is long enough for anything to become a ritual, even solitude. 22 Christmas Eves. That's how long I've been doing this alone, ever since Margaret. The office was quiet in the way that only large buildings get quiet after hours, not silent, but settled like the whole place had exhaled and was just breathing slowly until morning. I'd sent everyone home by 4. There was no reason for any of them to be here, and I've never been the kind of man who keeps people away from their families just to prove a point about dedication. The work would be there in January. The holidays wouldn't. The whiskey glass was still half full. I wasn't drinking so much as holding it the way you hold something familiar when your hands don't know what else to do. It was a good whiskey, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Margaret had always teased me about spending money on whiskey I barely drank. You just like having it there, she'd say. It's a prop. She wasn't wrong. She rarely was about the things that mattered. On the corner of my desk, in a simple wooden frame I'd had for longer than I could remember, was a photograph. Margaret young and laughing in that way, she had like whatever was funny was the funniest thing that had ever happened in the history of the world. Not a polished laugh, not the kind people perform for cameras. The real one, the one that started somewhere deep and worked its way out before she could decide whether to let it. And in her lap, a small girl with dark eyes and her mother's smile 5 years old and completely unaware that the camera was pointed at them. Natalie, my daughter, the reason I'd rebuilt everything that once fell apart. I was looking at that photograph when my phone buzzed against the desk. I glanced at the screen. Natalie. I answered before the second buzz. Hey, sweetheart. There was a pause, not long, maybe 2 seconds. But I've spent enough time in rooms where decisions get made to know that a 2-second pause before someone speaks usually means they've been practicing what they're about to say. I know that pause the way you know the sound of weather changing. Hi, Dad. Her voice was warm. It was always warm. That was one of the things about Natalie. She had her mother's gift for making the hard things sound gentle. Not dishonest, just careful. I'm glad I caught you. Are you at the office? Where else would I be on Christmas Eve? I said. It wasn't really a question. She laughed softly. Then the warmth shifted just slightly the way a room shifts when someone opens a window somewhere down the hall. You don't feel a draft exactly. You just know something changed. Dad, I've been meaning to talk to you about the holidays, about Christmas dinner. Okay, I said. Derek's family does things a certain way. The Hargroves, they were very particular about gatherings. It's formal, and it's a different world, honestly. I just think she stopped, started again. I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable, including you. I didn't say anything right away. I was looking at the photograph on my desk, Margaret laughing. Natalie at 5, not yet knowing what the world would ask of her. I thought about that little girl and tried to find the thread between her and the woman on the phone, and I could find it. I could always find it, but tonight it felt longer than usual, like the distance between 2 points that were once the same place. I think it would just be better this year. Natalie continued, her voice dropping lower. If it's just Derek's family, we'll do something in January, just the two of us. I promise. Somewhere nice wherever you want to go. The snow outside was coming down a little heavier now, soft and indifferent the way weather always is. I understand, sweetheart, I said. Yeah, don't worry about it. Another pause, shorter this time. I love you, Dad. I love you too, Natalie. The call ended. I set the phone face down on the desk and sat very still for a moment. I wasn't angry. That's the thing I want to be clear about even now looking back. Anger would have been simpler. Anger has an edge to it, something to push against. What I felt was something older and quieter, a kind of tired that doesn't come from working late or sleeping poorly. The kind that settles in when you realize the distance between you and someone you love has been growing so slowly and for so long that you can't even point to the moment it started. That's the worst kind of distance. The kind that arrives by accumulation without either person choosing it in any single moment. 30 years of building something from nothing. A company that employed 847 people. A name on a Forbes cover that I kept on the wall, not out of vanity, but as a reminder of a specific period when several people had written me off and turned out to be incorrect. And my own daughter thought I'd make the wrong people uncomfortable at a dinner table. I picked up the whiskey glass and set it back down without drinking. Outside, Chicago went on, doing what Chicago does, indifferent and luminous and relentless the way great cities always are. The snow kept falling. The lake sat dark and still at the edge of the world. After a while, I reached down and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Beneath a folder of year-end reports and a spare set of cufflinks, Margaret had given me one birthday silver, simple, the kind she knew I'd actually wear. There was an envelope. Old, the paper gone, the color of cream left too long in coffee, her handwriting on the front in the careful cursive she had learned from her mother and never lost. Robert, just my name. That was all she'd ever needed to write on the outside, because she always knew I'd know exactly what it was. She wrote it in 2001, a year before she passed, when she still had time and clarity and things she needed to say. I'd read it once in 2002, sitting in a much smaller office with a much emptier life, and I'd had to put it away because some words land too hard to carry all at once. I'd meant to go back to it, the way you always mean to go back to the things that matter most, and somehow never quite do not out of avoidance, but out of a quiet understanding that you're not yet the person who can read them the way they deserve to be read. I held the envelope in both hands for a moment, felt the weight of it not heavy, just present, the way a held breath is present. Then I placed it on top of the desk, beside the photograph of Margaret and 5-year-old Natalie. And I sat there in the quiet looking at her handwriting until the snow outside had buried the last of the evening light. I didn't open it. Not tonight. I turned off the desk lamp, pulled on my coat, and left the office the way I always leave it on Christmas Eve, quietly, without making a fuss, the same way I do most things that matter to me. Down the hall, past the empty desks and the dark screens, past the conference room, where tomorrow's problems were waiting patiently in their folders. The elevator doors opened and I stepped in. For a moment in the polished metal of the closing doors, I could see my own reflection, a 58-year-old man in a good coat, holding nothing, going home alone on Christmas Eve. I'd looked worse. The elevator descended, and outside the snow kept falling on the city, on the buildings and the river, and the dark, flat surface of the lake, the way snow always does. Without preference, without memory, without any particular interest in what any of it means. I didn't leave. I'd pressed the elevator button, watched the doors close, seen my own reflection staring back at me, and somewhere between the 42nd floor and the lobby, I'd changed my mind. I rode back up without really deciding to. Some nights the apartment feels too quiet in a way that the office with all its familiar silence does not. So I sat back down in the dark, didn't turn the lamp back on, just pulled the chair around to face the window, and held the photograph in both hands, Margaret and Natalie, that frozen moment of pure and uncomplicated joy, and let the memories come, the way they always come on this particular night. Not because I go looking for them, just because they know where I live. I remember the hospital corridor. It was 3 in the morning, the winter of 2002. The kind of cold that gets into a building no matter how hard the heating works. I was sitting in a row of plastic chairs outside a room I couldn't bring myself to go back into just yet. And Natalie, 8 years old, small for her age, wearing the sweater with the cartoon dog on the front that she'd refused to take off for 3 days, was asleep against my shoulder. Her breath was slow and even. Kids can do that, fall asleep anywhere, and something about it had always struck me as one of the bravest things a person can do. Just trust the world enough to close your eyes. Margaret had asked to speak with me alone earlier that evening. She'd waited until Natalie drifted off in the recliner by the window, then looked at me with those clear, steady eyes of hers, and said what she needed to say. "She has your stubbornness, Robert, and my blind spots. That's a difficult combination." A pause, the kind that means what comes next, has been thought about for a long time. Promise me you'll be patient with her, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I promised. I have kept that promise every day since. Though I'll admit there are ways of keeping a promise that look right from the outside and still manage to miss the point entirely. I remember her graduation, 2016. A university outside the city, a June afternoon that couldn't make up its mind between warm and overcast. I'd been in a meeting that morning that I genuinely could not leave, the kind that determines whether 400 people keep their jobs or start looking for new ones. I drove the 4 hours myself, rather than send a car, got there 12 minutes before they called her name, and sat alone in the back section of the bleachers with my jacket over my arm and a program I'd grabbed at the gate. When they announced her name, Natalie Ann Callahan, I clapped louder than anyone around me. A woman 2 seats over gave me a look. I didn't care. Natalie never knew I was there. I didn't tell her. She had friends around her, people her own age, and I didn't want to make it about me showing up. I just needed to be there. There's a difference, even if it's one I've never been very good at explaining. I remember the wedding, 2020. A Saturday in early October. One of those autumn days in the Midwest that feels like a gift, the air clean and sharp, the trees at their best. The ceremony was held at a country estate outside the city, the kind of place where everything is cream and gold and perfectly arranged. I wore the charcoal suit Margaret had picked out for me years before, the one she'd said made me look like I meant business without trying too hard. I sat in the front row because that's where they put the father of the bride, and I watched my daughter walk down the aisle, looking more like her mother than I'd ever seen her look before. The specific joy and specific grief of that moment, only a parent who has raised a child alone can fully understand it, I think. Derek met me at the reception. He shook my hand with the practiced ease of someone who had shaken a great many hands and learned exactly how much pressure communicates confidence without aggression. His eyes moved past my shoulder, almost immediately scanning the room behind me, cataloging something more interesting on the other side of the tent. I noticed. I filed it away. And then I let it go, because Natalie was happy, and her happiness had been the organizing principle of my life for a long time by then. That was my first mistake. Not the only one, but the first one worth naming. Because here is what I understood. Sitting alone in the dark on the 42nd floor, with my daughter's voice still fresh in my ear, I had spent 22 years protecting Natalie from everything difficult. Every hard conversation, every complicated truth, every version of myself that might have required explanation. I gave her safety and stability and every material thing she needed, and I kept the rest. The struggle, the story, the man behind the company, entirely to myself. I thought I was protecting her. What I was actually doing was disappearing. You can be present in every room and still be invisible to the people you love most if you never let them see past the surface of you. I had become somewhere along the way a man my own daughter didn't fully know. And if she didn't know me, really know me, then how could I blame her for failing to imagine what I'd built, or what it cost, or what it meant? I couldn't. That was the thing sitting heaviest in my chest as I finally stood, set the photograph back in its place on the corner of the desk, and pulled my coat on for the second time that night. The snow was still falling when I reached the parking garage. My truck, an old Ford pickup I'd driven for 9 years, because it ran well, and I'd never had much patience for acquiring things I didn't actually need, was the only vehicle left on the executive level. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. The garage was very quiet, just the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of the city doing what cities do, indifferent to anyone sitting alone inside them. 22 years of promises kept. And still somehow, my daughter had grown up not knowing who her father was. I thought about the envelope still sitting on my desk upstairs, Margaret's handwriting, her careful cursive, my name on the front. I'd placed it there beside the photograph before I left, and hadn't opened it same as every year. The time for that wasn't tonight. I knew that the same way I knew most things I couldn't fully explain, just a settled certainty that the right moment hadn't arrived yet. That I wasn't yet the person who could receive whatever was inside it the way it deserved to be received. Maybe next year, maybe sooner. I started the truck and pulled out into the night. The city spread wide and bright around me, the snow softening every edge, the streetlights haloed gold through the windshield. I drove the way I always drive when I'm thinking steadily without music, both hands on the wheel. The south side was quiet at this hour, the streets mostly empty. Just the occasional cab, the occasional figure moving quickly through the cold with somewhere to be. 22 Christmas Eves alone. And tonight had felt different from the others, though I couldn't have said exactly why. Heavier in some ways, clearer in others. Like a question I had been carrying for a long time had finally decided to make itself legible. I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew driving home through the snow with the city glowing around me and my daughter's voice still somewhere in my chest, that something had shifted, that the long, careful patience I'd been practicing with her with myself, with the particular silence that had grown up between us, was approaching the end of what patience alone could accomplish. There are things you can wait out, and there are things that, if you keep waiting, stop being possible. I turned onto my street and parked and sat for another moment before going inside. The snow was still falling, quiet, steady, without any interest in what it meant to anyone below. I got out of the truck and walked through it and went home. 2 days after Christmas, Chicago had stopped pretending the holidays were still happening. The decorations were still up, they always are. That awkward stretch between the 25th and New Year's, when the city looks festive but feels like it's just going through the motions. But the streets had that purposeful, slightly grim energy of people who had eaten too much, slept too little, and were quietly relieved to have somewhere to be again. I was one of them. I pulled my old Ford pickup into the parking structure at 6:45 in the morning, the same time I've been pulling in for the better part of 2 decades, and took my usual spot near the stairwell on the executive level. No reserved sign, no placard with my name. Just a corner space that the parking attendants had quietly kept clear for years, because they knew my habits, not because anyone told them to. I've always preferred it that way. Callahan Holdings operates out of the 42nd floor of a building on Wacker Drive. Not the tallest in the city, not the most famous address, but with a view of the river and the lake that on clear mornings makes you remember why you chose Chicago in the first place. The company's name appears on the lobby directory in modest lettering. My name does not. That was a deliberate decision made early on, and I've never had cause to revisit it. Marcus Webb was waiting at the elevator bank when I came up from the parking level. He is my chief operating officer, has been for going on 15 years, and is one of approximately 4 people on Earth I trust without reservation. He's 45, with the kind of steady, unhurried manner that makes people in meetings instinctively calm down. He was holding 2 cups of black coffee, the real kind from the place 2 blocks over, and wearing the expression he wears when he knows something I haven't asked about yet. "It's Merry Christmas," he said, handing me a cup. 2 days late, I said. I was being generous with the definition. We walked through the floor together, the way we do most mornings. Not because either of us needs the walk, but because it's the best way I know to take the temperature of a place. 847 people work for Callahan Holdings across 3 offices, and roughly 200 of them were at their desks this morning. They greeted me by name as we passed. Not Sir, not Mr. Callahan, just Robert. I'd made that request on the first day and repeated it firmly enough over the years that it had stuck. Marcus ran through the end-of-year numbers as we walked 3 major projects in final stages. 2 contracts pending signatures in the first week of January. 1 situation in the Ohio office that needed attention, but nothing that couldn't wait until the 3rd. I listened and asked the questions that needed asking, and by the time we reached my office at the end of the hall, I had a complete picture of where things stood. I stopped as I always stop in front of the frame magazine cover mounted on the wall just outside my office door. A financial publication from 2010-15 years ago, now with a photograph that caught me in profile mid-conversation with someone off-frame. You couldn't make out much of my face. That had been entirely intentional. The headline read, "The Quiet Builders Chicago's Most Influential Companies You've Never Heard Of." I hadn't put it up to celebrate. I had put it up to remember. To remember 200 square feet of rented office space in 1995, a desk bought secondhand, a phone borrowed from a friend until I could afford my own, and the specific feeling of starting over from nothing with a pregnant wife and a determination that the next version of this would be built differently, quietly, carefully, on foundations that couldn't be taken from me. Marcus watched me look at it the way he always does. "You going to tell me how Christmas was?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. I sat down and picked up my coffee. "Natalie called." "Good. She asked me not to come to her husband's family Christmas." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He's good at quiet, knows when to fill it and when to leave it alone. He left this one alone. "She was polite about it?" I said. "The Hargroves have a certain way of doing things. She didn't want anyone to feel out of place." I set the cup down. "She meant well." "I'm sure she did," Marcus said in the tone that means that he has a much stronger opinion than the one he's expressing. I said. He nodded, dropped it. That's another thing I value about Marcus. He knows which battles aren't his to fight. I looked out the window for a moment. The river below was moving slow and gray between its banks, the surface of it dull under the overcast sky. December in Chicago has a particular quality after the holidays, stripped of its pageantry back to its honest self. Cold, flat, unbothered. I find it easier to think in honestly than any other time of year. The truth was I hadn't slept well. I'd driven home through the snow on Christmas Eve with my daughter's voice sitting somewhere in my chest, and I'd lain awake in the apartment for a long time afterward, running through the same set of thoughts I'd been running through for months. The distance between Natalie and me hadn't arrived all at once. It had accumulated the way debt accumulates, the way weather accumulates, slowly enough that each individual change was easy to explain away, and only the total was impossible to ignore. She'd been happy at the wedding. That much I was certain of. The happiness had been real. I know my daughter well enough to know the difference. But happiness and clarity are not the same thing, and a person can be genuinely content inside an arrangement they don't fully understand. I knew that from experience. I had spent a significant portion of my own life making exactly that mistake. I set down the coffee and turned back to the desk. "Ohio," I said. "Walk me through it." Marcus opened his folder, and we moved on. The way you move on from the things you can't yet address, not dismissing them, just setting them to the side where they'll keep until you're ready. We worked through the scheduling conflict, talked through the acquisition question, covered 3 items on the January calendar that needed decisions before the 1st. It was good ordinary work, the kind that has its own rhythm once you're inside it. We were 20 minutes in when Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a business card on the edge of my desk. "Before I forget," he said, "this has been sitting in my pending file since April. They have reached out 11 times, calls, letters, 1 in-person visit to the lobby that I had Sandra redirect." He nodded at the card. "I kept putting them off because the timing never felt right. But at some point, not responding starts sending its own message." I picked up the card. Heavy stock, simple design, the company name in clean serif type. I read it, set it down, read it again. The name meant nothing to me, not yet. Just 2 words on a piece of cardstock, a company I'd never had reason to think about before this moment. And yet something about the persistence of it, 11 contacts over 8 months. The in-person visit, the consistency of the effort registered in the back of my mind as something worth noting. In my experience, that kind of sustained attention usually means one of two things. Either someone genuinely believes there's a deal worth making, or someone wants something they haven't said out loud yet. Either way, it was worth knowing which. 8 months, I said. Why so persistent? Marcus leaned back with the expression of a man who had been asking himself the same question. That's exactly what I'd like to know. I turned the card over. Nothing on the back, just the name, the address, a phone number. I placed it in the top right drawer of my desk and pushed it closed. Not today, I said. Fair enough, Marcus said and reached for his coffee. Outside, the river moved gray and slow between its banks, and the city was already reassembling itself after the holidays, putting away the sentiment, picking up the pace the way it always does. Reliable as January, indifferent as weather, I had work to do. I got to it. The first week of January has a particular feeling in the business world, a collective clearing of the throat, everyone pretending the holidays didn't happen, while quietly relieved they're over. Calendars fill back up. Inboxes that went untouched for 10 days suddenly demand attention. The city outside my window shifts from festive to functional, and I find I prefer it that way. Marcus came in on a Wednesday morning with a thin folder and an expression I've learned to read over 15 years of working together. There's a version of his face for financial problems, focused, slightly impatient, already calculating solutions. There's another version for operational headaches, resigned, methodical. And then there's this version, the one where his jaw is set a little too carefully and his eyes are doing more work than usual. That one means the problem isn't about numbers or logistics. That one means it's about people. He set the folder on my desk without preamble and sat down. Whitfield Construction pulled out of the Northside contract, he said. Signed agreement 3 weeks from completion on the preliminary phase. They walked. Whitfield was a small but reliable firm we'd partnered with on a modest commercial development. The kind of project that doesn't move the needle much financially, but matters because it represents a relationship, a handshake, a word kept. I'd worked with their director, a steady man named Gerald Whitfield, for going on 6 years. And Gerald doesn't walk, I said. Gerald walked, Marcus said. The reason he gave was vague enough to be meaningless. Something about internal restructuring and reallocating capacity. I've heard that excuse from companies that are genuinely struggling, and from companies that have been gotten to. Gerald's firm isn't struggling. So someone got to him. That's what I thought. So I looked into it. Marcus opened the folder and turned it to face me. One of my contacts at Gerald's bank mentioned that Gerald had received a call about 2 weeks before Christmas. Whoever called told him that Callahan Holdings was experiencing significant internal financial strain, that you were no longer effectively managing day-to-day operations. That signing a long-term agreement with us at this stage would be a considerable risk to his firm. I read the summary page. Then I looked up. You have the call? Marcus reached into the folder and produced a small digital recorder. He set it on the desk between us and pressed play. The voice on the recording was clear and confident, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has spent years in rooms where confidence is currency. It spoke smoothly with the measured cadence of a man delivering a rehearsed concern rather than a genuine one, painting a picture of a company quietly unraveling at the top. Very sorry to have to share this. Just thought you should know before committing. That sort of thing. I listened to the whole thing without moving. There's a phenomenon I've noticed over the years. Certain voices have a quality that stays with you even after a single encounter. The way a particular piece of music can surface in your memory months after you've heard it. Something in the timbre, the rhythm of the phrasing, the specific way consonants land. This voice had that quality. I'd heard it before. Briefly in passing at a large gathering, with a great deal of ambient noise and no particular reason to pay close attention. The wedding, 4 years ago. A receiving line, a handshake, a few exchanged words over the noise of the reception tent. My son-in-law. I set the recorder down, looked at the wall across from me for a moment. Not at anything in particular, just giving myself the space to let that land properly before deciding what to do with it. I have a rule about decisions made in the first 30 seconds of anger. Don't. Whatever action you take in that window is almost always the wrong one optimized for how you feel, rather than what you want to achieve. So, I waited. Let the recognition settle. Let it become information rather than emotion. Then I picked up my coffee and looked at Marcus. "What, handle the Whitfield contract," I said. "Find a replacement partner. There are 2 firms we've been meaning to bring in on something. Use this as the opportunity. Make sure Gerald doesn't suffer any collateral damage from this. He was worked on, not disloyal." Marcus nodded, writing. "And keep watching," I said. Quietly. "I want to know if this is a single incident or a pattern." Marcus finished writing, clicked his pen closed. Then he looked up at me with the careful expression of a man who has a question he's not entirely sure he should ask. "Do you know who that is?" he said. "On the recording." I held his gaze. "Yes." He waited a beat, giving me the opportunity to say more. I didn't take it. "Understood," he said. He stood, gathered the folder, and headed for the door. When it closed behind him, I sat with the silence for a moment. There are things you cannot unsee once you've seen them. Pieces of a picture that once placed make the whole image shift into something you can't unrecognize. I had spent 4 years choosing to interpret Derek's behavior, the distractedness, the practiced charm, the way his eyes move past you as the ordinary social habits of a certain kind of ambitious young man. Superficial. Not worth examining too closely. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. I opened the top drawer and took out the business card Marcus had given me the week before, turned it over in my hand, set it on the desk. Then I pulled a blank sheet of paper from the tray beside my keyboard, picked up a pen, and wrote one word in the center of the page in block letters. Hargrove. I drew a line beneath it, then another. I slid it into a fresh manila folder, wrote nothing on the tab, and placed it in the filing drawer on the left side of my desk, the one I keep for things that don't belong in the regular system yet. The one that means not finished, not forgotten, not ready to act on, but watched. Outside January was doing what January in Chicago always does, making itself impossible to ignore. The wind off the lake had picked up overnight, and even 42 floors up, you could feel the building lean into it just slightly. The way old structures do, when the weather reminds them what they're made of. I put the business card in the folder with the paper, closed the drawer, got back to work. The weekend came quietly, the way winter weekends in Chicago always do, not with any announcement. Just a slow graying of the sky and the particular stillness that settles over the city when most people have somewhere warm to be. I drove south on a Saturday morning, the old Ford moving through streets that grew quieter the further I got from the loop. The south side looked the way it always does. In January, bare trees, salted sidewalks, corner stores, with their lights on against the pale morning. I'd lived in that neighborhood for 11 years, back when the rent was something a construction foreman could manage. That was before Callahan Holdings existed as anything more than a name I'd written on a legal pad at the kitchen table. I still own the house. People find that strange. My accountant mentioned it once very carefully, the way people mention things they consider mildly irrational. I told him some things aren't on the balance sheet. He didn't bring it up again. I parked in front and sat for a moment before getting out. The house looks the same from the outside. Same dark shutters. Same narrow front porch. The city repaved the street sometime in the last decade, but the crack in the sidewalk near the gate, the one Natalie used to hop over as a child, always with both feet, always announcing it that crack is still there. I don't know why I notice that every time. I just do. Margaret's garden runs along the left side of the house, between the brick wall and the front window. In spring, it fills in fast. She planted things that come back on their own perennials, because she said she didn't want a garden that needed to be convinced to grow every year. In January, it's just bare stems and a thin layer of snow pressed flat by its own weight. I brought a thermos of coffee from the place near my apartment. I pulled the collar of my coat up and sat on the porch step, the way I always do, facing the garden. This has been my habit for 22 years. I don't fully understand it myself. I don't believe in the idea that the dead can hear us. I've never been the kind of man who finds comfort in that thought. But I've found that talking out loud, even into empty winter air, does something useful. It forces me to put things in order, to say them plainly, to hear how they sound when spoken rather than just circling in my head. So I talk. I told her about the Christmas call, about Natalie's voice, careful, apologetic in tone, firm in meaning, about the exact words "it would be better if you didn't come." I said them out loud there on the porch step, and they didn't feel any smaller for being spoken. If anything, they felt more precise. Natalie is 30 years old. She made a choice. She made it quietly, and she made it clearly, and I had told her I understood. I told Margaret about Derek. I kept it factual, the way a voice on a recording can be recognized, how certainty settles in without drama when you already know something is true. I told her about the contract that dissolved the manufactured rumors, the business card I'd filed away, the name I had written down twice and underlined. Then I stopped talking for a while and just held the thermos. There's a particular quality to silence in that garden. The city is never completely quiet. There's always a distant sound, a train, a truck, someone's radio. But the garden seems to absorb a layer of it, the way heavy fabric absorbs sound. Margaret chose this house partly for that reason. She said it felt like a place where you could actually think. I was thinking about a conversation we had when Natalie was 6 or 7. She'd come home from school upset about a friend who had lied to her a small thing, the way children's conflicts always are and aren't. Margaret sat with her for a long time. I remember watching from the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. Later, when Natalie was asleep, Margaret said something I didn't fully understand at the time. You can't keep building walls around her, Robert. She has to learn to see people for who they actually are. That's not something you can do for her. I'd thought she was talking about Natalie's friend. Looking back, I'm not sure she was only talking about that. I've spent a long time protecting Natalie from difficulty. Not in ways that were obvious. I wasn't the kind of father who hovered or intervened. But I absorbed things quietly. Problems that could have reached her, I redirected. Conversations that might have complicated her picture of me, I didn't have. I thought I was giving her stability. I wonder now if I was giving her a version of me that wasn't complete enough to be useful to her. She doesn't know who I am. Not fully. She knows I work in real estate. She knows I'm comfortable. But the scale of it, the years of it, the specific shape of what I built, none of that is something she ever asked about, and I never offered it. I thought I was waiting for the right moment. I'm not sure that moment ever came, or that I was ever the one who should have initiated it. The question I kept coming back to, sitting there in January, cold with lukewarm coffee, was whether that silence had cost her something, whether growing up without a clear picture of where she came from had made it harder for her to recognize what she was walking into. I didn't have an answer. The garden didn't offer one. The bare stems didn't move. But I knew what Margaret would say because she said it more than once in more than one context, and she meant it every time. Stop asking what you did wrong. Start asking what you're going to do next. Not as permission to stop caring, not as a way of moving on without accounting, just as the only direction that's ever actually available. The past is settled. The next hour isn't. I finished the coffee. I sat a few minutes longer. A cardinal, the only real color in that garden in January, landed on one of the bare stems, looked at nothing in particular, and left. I was thinking about what the next step looked like when my phone buzzed against my coat pocket. Marcus. I answered on the second ring. His voice was quiet and even, which was how I knew it was serious. Marcus Webb doesn't lower his voice unless something requires it. Sir, Derek has made a significantly larger move. You're needed at the office. I looked at the garden one more time. The stem where the cardinal had been was still trembling slightly. I'll be there in 40 minutes, I said. I capped the empty thermos, stood up from the porch step, and walked back to the truck. If you're still here, leave a quick comment so I know you're with me. And tell me this. If you were in my position, would you stay silent and watch, or walk straight into that room and face them when it matters most? And just a quick note before we continue, parts of what you're about to hear may include fictional elements added for storytelling. If it's not for you, feel free to stop here. But if you stay, you'll understand why this moment changes everything. Marcus was already at his desk when I arrived at the office that Saturday afternoon. He had his coat still on, which told me he'd come in the moment he found out. He's been with me long enough that I don't need to ask him to explain. I just sat down across from him and waited. It took him about 4 minutes to lay it out. The gala, the one they call the Chicago Winter Charitable Evening, the largest fundraiser of its kind in the city, had been in the works for months. I've supported it quietly for 7 consecutive years through the Callahan Foundation, which operates entirely separately from my business holdings. The foundation handles contributions to housing initiatives, early education programs, and workforce training. It has its own board, its own administrative staff. My name is attached to it in the filings, but publicly we've always kept it understated. That was a deliberate choice, and it suited me fine. This year, someone had accessed the event's guest coordination process and removed my name from the confirmed attendee list. Marcus had discovered it when the event organizer reached out to his office, confused apologetic, because they had already printed the program. The foundation was listed as the evening's largest contributing sponsor. The name Robert Callahan was supposed to appear in the official remarks. And someone, through a series of coordinated messages to the organizing committee, had made the case that there had been a clerical error, that I would not be attending, and that any formal acknowledgement should be redirected. The organizer had found Marcus's contact information through older correspondence and called him directly to verify. Marcus set a printed copy of the message chain on the desk between us. I read through it once. The language was careful, plausible enough to have worked, if the organizer hadn't thought to double-check. The sender had used a third-party address that didn't trace back to anything obvious. But the timing and the specific knowledge of the Foundation's internal correspondence schedule told its own story. I slid the papers back across the desk. "Is the event still tonight?" I asked. 7 o'clock, Marcus said. "The grand ballroom at the Langham." "And then we go," I said. "I'll need a car by 6. He nodded once and didn't ask anything further. The Langham sits on the river, and in January the walk from the car to the entrance is brief and very cold. Marcus and I arrived 11 minutes before the program was scheduled to begin. I wore the same dark suit I keep at the office for occasions that require one no boutonniere, no event badge. I don't find it necessary to announce what I am in a room where most people already know, and in rooms where they don't, the suit is enough. The ballroom was full, 300 people, perhaps a few more. Round tables, low candlelight, the kind of orchestrated elegance that costs a significant amount of money to make look effortless. I recognized most of the faces, not all by name but by category. Developers, attorneys, foundation board members, city officials. People I dealt with across tables and across the years. I was scanning the room when I saw her. Natalie was standing near the far end of the hall, close to one of the high windows that looked out onto the river. She was wearing a green dress, deep green, not the bright kind, and her hair was pinned up. She looked like her mother, in a way that still catches me off guard sometimes, even after all these years. Not identical, but something in the posture, the way she holds her chin when she's listening to someone talk. Margaret stood the same way. Derek was beside her, one hand resting against the small of her back. From across the room, with the candlelight and the distance, it might have looked like the comfortable ease of a long partnership. I knew better. I'd known better since January, and I'd known something was wrong even before that, since the wedding, since the way he'd shaken my hand without looking at me. But Natalie looked comfortable. She was laughing at something the woman across from her had said, and the laugh was real. I know my daughter's real laugh. Whatever was wrong in that marriage, she still had moments of genuine ease. I held on to that. Standing to Derek's left was a man I didn't immediately place. Tall, silver-haired, the kind of posture that comes from decades of believing a room belongs to you. Something about his face was familiar in the vague way that faces sometimes are a shape, a quality of attention. But the name didn't surface. I moved on. The program began at 7:15. The MC was efficient, a woman I recognized from the Foundation's board correspondence, and she moved through the opening remarks at a good pace. When she reached the sponsor acknowledgments, she paused slightly before reading the largest contribution. "This year's lead benefactor," she said, "through the Callahan Foundation, Mr. Robert Callahan." The room turned. That's the only way to describe it, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a room shifts when a name lands with weight. I was already walking toward the stage. I kept it short, 2 minutes maybe, slightly under. I spoke about the Foundation's work, the apprenticeship program that had placed over 200 people in skilled trades positions in the last 3 years, the early literacy initiative in 4 Southside schools. I didn't speak about myself. There was nothing to add on that front that the work didn't already say. When I stepped off the stage, I took a route back through the room that passed near the windows. I didn't plan it exactly, but I didn't avoid it either. Natalie saw me coming before I reached her. I watched her expression change, surprise first, then something more complicated and harder to name. Derek's hand moved slightly at her back. I met her eyes for exactly 1 second. I held them. Then I gave a single small nod, the kind that says, "I see you, and I'm not making this harder than it needs to be tonight," and kept walking. I heard nothing behind me. No voice called out. I didn't expect one. Marcus fell into step beside me near the rear of the room, and we were at the coat check within 2 minutes. In the car, he said, "The man standing next to Derek, silver hair left side. He watched you walk off that stage and didn't stop watching until you were at the door." I thought back. The tall man, the familiar posture. "Did you recognize him?" I asked. "Not yet," Marcus said, "but I will." I looked out the window at the river, dark and flat under the January sky. "Take your time," I said. I didn't take the highway home. There was no particular reason for it. The highway would have been faster, cleaner, fewer lights. But I turned onto Michigan Avenue instead and drove north through the city at whatever pace the traffic allowed. Sometimes the longer route is the right one. Not because it gets you somewhere different, but because it gives you more time inside your own head before you have to step back into everything else. The city was quiet the way it gets on a January Saturday night, not empty but settled. The kind of quiet where the streetlights seem brighter than they actually are, reflected off the snow along the curbs. I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't turn on anything. No music, no radio. Just the road and whatever I was trying to sort out. I was thinking about 1 second. That's all it had been, 1 second of eye contact across a ballroom floor. But I've learned over a long time, and in a lot of different rooms, that 1 second is enough to carry a considerable amount of information if you know how to receive it. Natalie had looked at me, and I'd seen something I wasn't prepared to name yet. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't the particular stiffness of someone caught in a situation they had engineered. It was something with more layers to it. Something I needed more time with before I started drawing conclusions. I was still working through it when my phone rang. The number on the console screen was Natalie's. I answered through the car speaker and kept my eyes on the road. "Dad." Her voice was different from the Christmas call. That one had been rehearsed. I'd heard it in the cadence and the careful spacing between phrases. This one wasn't. This was the voice she uses when something has cut through whatever she'd prepared to say, and she's speaking from somewhere closer to the surface. "Why didn't you ever tell me about the foundation?" "We expressed in bonnet and besarged." I let a moment pass before I answered. Would it have mattered, Natalie? It wasn't meant as a deflection, though. I understood it could sound like one. I genuinely didn't know the answer. I hadn't kept it from her deliberately. It simply hadn't come up in the kind of conversations we'd been having for the last several years, which were conversations about scheduling, about logistics, about the surface details of two lives that had grown increasingly parallel rather than intersecting. She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched long enough that I checked the speaker to make sure the call was still connected. It was. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted. Not in content, she hadn't found her way to whatever the real sentence was, but the quality of it changed. Faster, lower the words pressed a little closer together. "I have to go, Dad." The call ended. I drove 2 more blocks before I pulled to a stop at a red light. I sat there after the light changed, and a car behind me tapped its horn once before I moved. That pattern, the abrupt ending, the voice dropping the sudden retreat, I'd noticed it before. Not once or twice, but across enough occasions over the last couple of years that it had registered without my quite allowing myself to look at it directly. The Christmas call, a birthday dinner 2 years ago where she'd excused herself mid-sentence to answer a message. A phone call sometime last spring where she'd said, "Give me 1 minute," and the minute had stretched to 20 before she texted to say something had come up. Each one individually had been easy enough to set aside. People are busy. Conversations get interrupted. I hadn't wanted to see a pattern where there might only be coincidence. But standing outside a ballroom tonight, I had watched my daughter's face across a crowded room for exactly 1 second. And the thing I'd seen there wasn't a daughter who had made choices she stood behind. It was a daughter who was holding something carefully, the way you hold something you're afraid of dropping, not because it belongs to you, but because you've been told it's yours to carry. I know that look, I've seen it in enough different faces, in enough different professional situations to recognize it when it appears. People who are free make eye contact and hold it. People who are carrying something they didn't choose look at you for a moment and then they look away. And the looking away is the real communication. Natalie had looked at me for 1 second and then looked away. I had been telling myself for months that her choices were her own, that my job was not to intervene, not to read too much into the spaces between her words, not to impose my understanding of a situation onto a life that wasn't mine to interpret. That was still true. It remained true. I wasn't ready to call what I was feeling anything more than a quiet, unverified unease, the kind that sits in your chest without a name and asks only to be taken seriously. But I was taking it seriously now. I parked outside my building just after 9. I sat in the truck for a few minutes after I turned the engine off. The building's entrance light threw a narrow yellow stripe across the snow on the sidewalk, and I watched a man walk through it with his hands in his pockets, his breath visible in the cold, and I thought about what it costs to stay quiet when quiet is the wrong choice. I pulled out my phone and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was still awake and still working, which was not surprising. A morning would work better, I said, but I need you to look into something for me. Of course, he said. Is this about Hargrove Capital? I've got another thread I've been following on the... No, I said, something else. A pause on his end. Marcus has been with me long enough to know when something else means something I'm not ready to say out loud yet. He didn't ask me to be more specific. It's 7 o'clock, he said. 7 o'clock, I confirmed. I got out of the truck and walked through the yellow stripe on the sidewalk, hands in my coat pockets, into the building. Whatever I was trying to name was still unnamed, but I'd stopped walking past it. That was enough for tonight. Late January in Chicago has a particular quality that the other winter months don't quite match. December is cold, but it carries the weight of the holidays, the lights, the sense that people are moving towards something. February, at least, has the consolation of being nearly over. January just is flat gray, unrelenting, with no ceremony to soften it. It was that kind of morning when Marcus came into my office and set a folder on the desk that was noticeably thicker than the one from 3 weeks prior. He didn't say anything at first. He poured coffee from the carafe on the side table for himself, as well as for me, which he only does when he expects the conversation to take a while, and he sat down across from the desk. I opened the folder. I read the way I've learned to read documents over 30 years of working with them, not word by word, but by pattern by structure, looking for the places where the language gets careful, where the numbers shift, where a timeline has a gap that hasn't been explained. I turned pages at a steady pace, land acquisition records, partnership filings, correspondence logs, incorporation documents going back to the mid-90s. Then I reached a page near the back of the stack and I stopped. A name, a project designation, a year. I set the page down flat on the desk and looked at it for a moment without touching anything else. What I knew then, 1994. I was 28 years old, and I believed with the particular certainty that belongs to people who have worked very hard for something and can finally see it taking shape, that I was building something that would last. The company was small, 12 employees, a rented office in a building that also housed a dry cleaner and an insurance broker. We did residential construction, mostly renovation work, with 2 larger projects in progress. I'd taken on debt to fund the growth, which was the standard approach and which I understood the risk of, and I was managing it carefully. Margaret was in her 6th month, and we just moved into the South Side house. Everything felt like it was arriving at the same time, which I think is true for a lot of people. At 28, the work and the life and the future all converging at once. A man named Edward came into that picture through a mutual contact in the development community. He was 34, already established, with a reputation for identifying undervalued parcels in suburban corridors before anyone else moved on them. He had the kind of confidence that reads as competence until you've seen enough of it to understand the difference. He proposed a joint venture on a residential development project in a northwestern suburb, a significant parcel, the kind that if it worked, would have set my company on a different trajectory entirely. We spent 2 months in due diligence. I put in everything I had, and more committed resources, signed agreements, brought my team fully onto the project. Margaret made dinners for the late nights I spent at the kitchen table going over the numbers. She didn't complain, she rarely did. She asked good questions when I talked about it, and she listened to the answers. 6 months later, the project was gone. The main contractor pulled out. The financing structure, which I had believed to be secured, collapsed in a sequence of events that happened faster than I could respond to. The partnership agreement had provisions I hadn't fully appreciated, clauses that, under the specific conditions that materialized, left me exposed in ways that were not recoverable. The company filed for dissolution in November of that year. I was left with the debt, the rented office I could no longer afford, 12 people who needed to find other work, and a wife in her 3rd trimester who watched me sit at that kitchen table and said, very quietly, "We'll build it again, Robert. Start there." I didn't understand what had happened. I understood that I had made errors in judgment. I cataloged them, examined them, carried them with me as a set of lessons I intended not to repeat. But I had never understood the mechanism, how a project that was sound could collapse so completely. I attributed it to inexperience, to the specific dynamics of that financing structure, to the ordinary cruelty of certain market conditions. I moved forward because there was no other available direction. What Marcus found 30 years later. He let me finish reading before he spoke. That's one of the things I value about Marcus. He understands that some information needs to be received before it can be discussed. The partnership agreement had a clause in Section 14. He said that allowed the senior partner to trigger a restructuring under specific conditions. Those conditions were written narrowly enough that they wouldn't normally occur unless someone with access to the project's internal financial reporting chose to create them. I looked up at him. There's a consulting firm listed in the 1994 records, he continued. They provided financial oversight services to the project. They were contracted by Edward, not by the joint venture, but by him personally through a separate entity. Their assessment of the project's viability was submitted to the financing institution 12 days before the main contractor withdrew. The assessment was negative, significantly and specifically negative in ways that targeted the exact provisions your company was depending on. I said nothing. The parcel, Marcus said, was acquired at auction 8 months after the project dissolved. The acquiring entity was a holding company incorporated in Delaware 3 months before your project collapsed. That holding company was the direct precursor to what is now registered as Hargrove Capital. The room was very quiet. Outside, the January sky sat low and gray over the city. I should have cross-referenced the family connections earlier, Marcus said, and his voice carried something in it that was not quite an apology and not quite anything else, just the plain statement of a man who holds himself to a standard. I was looking at Hargrove Capital as a business entity. I wasn't running searches on family names. If I had, "You found it," I said. "That's what matters." He nodded once and didn't say anything further on that point. I closed the folder. I looked at the window for a moment, the flat gray light, the top floors of the building across the street. "Where is he now?" I asked. I already suspected the answer, but there is a difference between suspecting something and having it confirmed, and I wanted the confirmation said out loud. Marcus looked at me directly. "He's been attempting to reach this office for 8 months, he said. "The business card, the 11 unanswered contacts, and his son married your daughter 4 years ago." I closed my eyes. Not for long, 5 seconds perhaps. The kind of pause that isn't weakness, but is the only honest response to a certain category of information. The kind that reorders everything you thought you understood about a 30-year stretch of your own life. Then I opened them. Marcus closed the conference room door behind him before he sat down. That alone told me something. In 15 years of working together, Marcus has closed that door exactly 3 times before today. Once when he had to tell me a project manager had been taking payments from a subcontractor. Once when a regulatory filing had an error that required immediate attention. Once when he got the call that his father had passed, and he needed a private room to collect himself before telling his team. He closed it now and sat across from me, and his expression was not the expression of a man who was worried. Worried is something Marcus does with his hands, a slight movement, a pen tapped twice on the table. This was different. This was the face of a man who had looked at something clearly and did not enjoy what he saw. I waited. "The North Chicago parcels," he said. I knew the one, 4 acres in a corridor that had been underutilized for the better part of a decade, a former light industrial zone that the city had rezoned for mixed residential use 18 months ago. I'd been patient with it running the planning process, carefully keeping the development timeline flexible while we worked through the community engagement process. The project Workforce Housing, 400 units at rates accessible to households in the middle income range, was the largest single initiative Callahan Holdings had planned for the next 5 years. It was the kind of project I built the company to do. "What about it?" I asked. Marcus laid out what he'd found, and he did it the way he always does, sequentially, without editorializing, letting the facts establish their own weight. Derek had been working the parcel for approximately 60 days. The approach was layered not a single action, but a coordinated sequence. First, a series of challenges to the title documentation filed through a third-party legal entity that had no apparent connection to Hargrove Capital on its face. The challenges were technically valid minor procedural irregularities in a county transfer from 11 years ago. But the timing and the specificity of the filings suggested that someone had done careful research before pulling the trigger. While the title was under challenge, a separate set of conversations had begun with 3 of the smaller investors who held minority positions in the parcel's development entity. The conversations had been conducted quietly without any documentation that Marcus had been able to locate, but 2 of the 3 investors had since reached out to our office independently, within days of each other, to ask questions about the project's financial position that they had not asked before. Someone had been talking to them, someone had been raising doubts. The third piece was a set of communications Marcus had traced to a government affairs firm that Hargrove Capital retained on a retainer basis. That firm had been in contact with 2 members of the city's zoning review board. The content of those communications wasn't accessible, but the timing immediately following the title challenges formed a clear enough picture. Marcus placed a printed summary on the table between us and let me read it through once. "He's using Hargrove Capital's name on the filings?" I asked. "The third-party legal entity," Marcus said, "is incorporated under a different name, but its registered agent is the same individual who handles 3 other Hargrove Capital subsidiaries. It's the same tree, different branch." I set the summary down. There is a particular kind of calculation that belongs to someone who believes they understand the proportions of a conflict, who the parties are, what resources each side can bring, how long a sustained engagement could run. Derek had made that calculation. He'd looked at a parcel held by a private real estate company and concluded that a sustained legal and political campaign backed by Hargrove Capital's resources and relationships would eventually create conditions that made holding the parcel more costly than releasing it. He was planning for attrition. He was planning to win by exhaustion. He had no way of knowing whose property he was targeting. And he had no way of knowing that the name on the business card he'd been operating under had not authorized any of this. "Does Edward Hargrove know what his son-in-law is doing with the company's name?" I asked. Marcus shook his head without hesitation. "Based on what I can see, the activity is entirely self-directed. The entities involved don't appear in any documentation that would cross Edward Hargrove's desk through normal oversight. Derek has structured this to run below the threshold where it would surface in a routine review." I sat with that for a moment. Edward had spent 8 months trying to reach me. I had not taken those calls, I hadn't known who he was, and by the time I did, I'd needed time to understand what I was dealing with before I sat across from him. But Edward had been reaching out through legitimate channels, through the proper contact processes without pressure or leverage. Whatever his intentions were, and I had a significant amount of unresolved history with those intentions, he had not been running a back-channel operation. He had been waiting. His son-in-law had not been waiting. I looked at the summary on the table for a moment longer, then pushed it to the side. "I need everything, Marcus," I said. "Every document, every transaction record, every contact that can be traced, every filing, every registration, every communication that has a name or an address or a date attached to it. I won't walk into a room with a partial picture. Marcus picked up his pen. "How much time do I have?" 10 days, I said. He wrote something down, a short note, the kind he makes when he's beginning to organize a large task in his head. Then he looked up. "Walk into which room, sir?" I opened the top right drawer of the conference table. The Hargrove Capital business card was still there where I'd placed it 2 months ago. I held it for a moment, then set it on the table between us, facing Marcus. "Schedule a meeting," I said. "Tell them that the chairman of Callahan Holdings is finally ready to discuss a potential partnership arrangement." Marcus looked at the card. He looked at me. He didn't ask anything further. He picked up his notebook, stood, and walked to the door. 10 days, he said, confirming. 10 days, I said. He opened the door, and the sound of the office came back in keyboards, a distant phone. The low hum of a building that has 847 people working inside it, for reasons that have nothing to do with any of this. I looked at the card on the table and thought about a parcel of land in North Chicago where 400 families were supposed to live someday. That hadn't changed. It was still going to happen. The office empties out by 7 on most evenings. By 9, the only sounds are the building itself, the low mechanical breath of the ventilation system, the occasional elevator moving between floors, the distant percussion of the city beyond the glass. I've spent more evenings here than I could count. I know its rhythms the way, a place you've returned to so many times that it has stopped feeling like somewhere you go and started feeling like somewhere you simply are. Tonight I didn't mind the quiet. The folder sat on the desk in front of me, the complete record that Marcus and his team had assembled over 10 days of careful, unglamorous work. Bank filings and corporation records, communication, traces third-party assessments. A documented timeline of 31 separate actions taken against Callahan Holdings, interests over the preceding 8 months. Every document was tabbed, every relevant passage marked with a small colored flag. Marcus doesn't do things halfway. I had read it 3 times. I didn't need to read it a 4th. The desk lamp was the only light on in the office. I had a cup of coffee to my left, cold now untouched for the last hour. I hadn't been drinking it so much as keeping it there. Something about having a cup of coffee on the desk makes a late night feel intentional rather than just prolonged. I reached into the bottom left drawer and took out the photograph. Not the one that sits in its frame on the corner of the desk. That one is from Natalie's childhood, Margaret holding her at the house, a summer afternoon. This one was smaller, unframed, printed on the kind of paper that photographers used in the early 90s, when everything was still developed at a shop, and handed back to you in a paper envelope. The edges had softened with time. I kept it in the drawer because it felt too private for the desk. It was from 1993. Margaret and I were standing outside a building downtown. I don't remember now which one or why we were there, and someone had asked if they could take our picture, and she'd said yes before I could respond, which was entirely like her. She was 25. I was 27. She was laughing at something, probably at me, which was also entirely like her, and I was looking at her instead of the camera. We had nothing yet in 1993. The first company didn't exist. The Southside House didn't exist. Natalie didn't exist. There was just the 2 of us and whatever we were in the process of becoming, which we didn't know yet, which I think was part of why she was laughing. I held the photograph under the lamp for a long moment. Then I set it on the desk beside the folder and looked at both of them together, the record of everything that had happened in the last 30 years. And the image of 2 people who didn't know any of it was coming. And I asked myself the question I'd been circling all evening without quite landing on it directly. What do I actually want from tomorrow? Not from Edward, not from Derek, not from the meeting as a tactical event, or from the documents in the folder, or from the legal position that Marcus had spent 10 days constructing with care. Those were instruments. I knew what I wanted from them. What I didn't yet have a clean answer to was the question underneath the one that has nothing to do with strategy. I wanted to look at myself clearly and recognize the person I saw. That sounds simpler than it is. I've spent 30 years making decisions under pressure, most of them, in rooms where I was the only person who didn't want something from me. I've done things right, and I've done things wrong, and I've done things that were neither just necessary. But there is a specific quality of self-recognition that I've found matters more than most of the external measures The ability to look at your own actions honestly and find that you can account for them. Not perfectly, not without regret in places, but account for them. The man I wanted to be tomorrow was the man Margaret had trusted when she'd said, "We'll build it again," on the worst night of 1994. Not because he was impressive or because he was winning, or because the room respected him, because he didn't need to diminish anyone else in order to stand up straight. That was still the standard. It hadn't changed. I pulled a notepad from the desk drawer, a plain one, the kind I use for working notes, and I wrote something on it. It took me about 2 minutes. It wasn't long. I didn't read it back. I folded the paper twice, wrote nothing on the outside, and placed it in the back of the bottom right drawer behind the hanging files where I keep personal documents. I would know where it was. I stood up. The city from the 42nd floor at 10 o'clock on a February night is a particular kind of view, the lights arranged in their fixed patterns, the dark gaps where the river runs, the distant red blink of aircraft warning lights on the taller buildings to the north. I've stood at this window hundreds of times. I stood at it for a minute now, not thinking about anything specific, just being in the room for a moment before leaving it. My phone buzzed on the desk. I crossed back and picked it up. The screen showed Natalie's name. The message was short. "Dad, I heard there's a meeting tomorrow. Something about Hargrove. I don't know how you know them, but please be careful." I read it once. I read it again. She knew about the meeting. She'd said she didn't know how I was connected to the Hargrove family, which meant she didn't know that the chairman of Callahan Holdings her husband had been maneuvering against was her father. She was warning me about a meeting she thought I was walking into from the outside. She was worried about me. Not about the outcome, not about the business, about me. I typed 3 words and sent them before I could revise them into something more measured. "I'll be fine." I put on my coat, picked up the folder, turned off the desk lamp, and walked out of the office. The elevator was quiet all the way down. The morning of February 14th arrived gray and still, the way Chicago mornings do in the middle of winter, when the season has run long enough that even the cold has become routine. I was dressed and in the car by 7:15. The suit was dark charcoal, fitted close, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but holds its shape across a long day. The tie was navy blue, a color I don't wear often, but today felt like the right occasion for it. Margaret had given me a tie in exactly that shade once years ago and told me it was the color of someone who had already decided. I bought a new one in the same color every few years. This morning I had taken longer than usual choosing it, which I noted without judgment, and moved on. Marcus was waiting at the elevator when I reached the 42nd floor. He was in his dark suit, the one he saves for situations that require it, and he was holding 2 cups of coffee, which was unnecessary and exactly like him. He looked at me for a moment. "Ready," he said. "I've been ready for a long time," I said. He handed me the coffee and we walked to the conference room. The room faces north and west, which means that on a clear morning you get the full spread of the city, and beyond it, the lake. Today the sky was a flat silver gray, and the lake was barely distinguishable from the horizon, just a darker gray meeting a lighter one somewhere out past the buildings. The snow that had blanketed the city since December had mostly gone, leaving the streets clean and wet. There is something about a city in mid-February without its snow cover, stripped of the thing that had softened it, that feels honest. Like the city is showing you what it actually is. The conference table seats 14. We were using all of it today. I sat at the head. Marcus was to my immediate left. Our general counsel, a measured woman named Patricia, who has been in that role for 9 years and who I have never seen visibly concerned in a business setting, sat to my right. 2 additional attorneys from our outside firm occupied the next seats. Research documentation was arranged in folders at each position closed. The Forbes cover was on the wall to the right of the door, the way it has been for 14 years. Not as decoration, but as a reminder of a specific period when several people in this industry had written us off and turned out to be incorrect. Beside it, mounted in a simple frame, was a photograph from the first year of Callahan Holdings. 4 people standing outside a rented office space on a winter afternoon, in coats that weren't quite warm enough, grinning, because we just signed the lease and didn't yet know how hard the next 3 years were going to be. I had looked at that photograph 10,000 times. I didn't look at it now. I looked at the door, They arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. Derek came in first. He moved the way men move when they believe the room is already theirs, a particular kind of stride that takes up slightly more space than necessary, that assumes trajectory rather than permission. He was in a dark suit well made, and he carried himself with the ease of someone who had sat across from a lot of tables and had not yet encountered one that gave him difficulty. He didn't look at the person at the head of the table immediately. That was something I had noticed before in other rooms. With other men like him, the ones who believe their arrival is the event, not what's already waiting for them. His attorneys filed in behind him, 3 of them crisp and prepared, carrying the kind of organized confidence that comes from believing you've done the preparation and are ready for whatever the other side has. They took seats along the left side of the table. A senior associate I didn't recognize by name distributed folders to each of them with practiced efficiency. I watched the door. Edward came in last. He was taller than I remembered, or perhaps it was just that I was seeing him clearly for the first time in 30 years, with the full context of who he was and what he'd done. Silver-haired, straight-backed, the kind of man who fills a room simply by entering it in a certain way. He wore a dark suit and no tie, which was either deliberate or simply habit. He had the eyes of someone who has spent decades reading rooms quickly, and he was reading this one. His gaze moved across the people at the table. Efficient practice, the rapid assessment of a man who has been in a lot of negotiations. He registered Marcus without pause. He registered Patricia without pause. He registered the attorneys without pause. Then he saw the Forbes cover. He stopped. Not visibly, not in a way that would have been obvious to someone who wasn't paying close attention, but his stride fractured by half a step, and his eyes held the cover for a moment longer than casual observation requires. I watched his gaze move from the cover to the man sitting at the head of the table, then back to the cover, then to the man again. The room was quiet. It is often quiet at the beginning of these things, a brief collective stillness before the mechanics of the meeting begin to move. This quiet was different. This quiet was the specific sound of something falling into place. I stood, not quickly, slowly, deliberately in the way that signals you have arrived somewhere and have no urgency about what comes next. I extended my hand across the corner of the table. "Edward," I said, "it's been a long time." He looked at my hand. He looked at my face. The color in his expression shifted in a way that was impossible to precisely describe and impossible to misread. "Robert Callahan," he said, and his voice was very low, the way voices get when a person is recalibrating in real time. "Is this the same Robert Callahan who—" "Sit down, Edward," I said. My voice was level, not cold, not warm, simply certain. "We have a great deal to discuss." The silence that followed was absolute. Derek turned his head. He looked from Edward standing at the corner of the room with an expression Derek had probably never seen on his face before, to me standing at the head of the table with my hand still extended, waiting. I watched Derek's eyes make the connection without fully understanding it yet. Something had changed in the room between 1 second and the next, and he didn't know what, and the not knowing was beginning to register on his face. It wasn't recognition what I saw in Derek's eyes. It was the beginning of the understanding that he should have learned more before he walked into this room. I held my hand in the air until Edward took it. Then we all sat down. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Marcus reached for the water pitcher at the center of the table and began filling the glasses nearest to him methodically without comment, moving around the table with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that certain moments require an ordinary action to give people somewhere to put their attention, while the extraordinary one settles. It was exactly the right thing to do, and he knew it, and he did it without being asked. I waited until he finished. I waited until everyone had a glass in front of them, and there was no more motion in the room to serve as distraction. Then I rested my hands flat on the table, and I began. In the spring of 1994, I said I was 28 years old. I had 12 employees, a rented office, 2 active projects, and a third that I believe was going to change the trajectory of everything I was building. I wasn't looking at Derek. I wasn't looking at the attorneys. I was looking at Edward, and Edward was looking at me, and there was no performance in either direction, just 2 men, the same table, 30 years of accumulated distance between them. A man I'd been introduced to through a mutual contact in the development community proposed a joint venture. A residential parcel in the Northwest Corridor, significant size, good positioning, the kind of project that could have established my company as something more than a regional renovation outfit. I committed everything I had to it, every resource, every relationship, every dollar of credit I could access. I didn't modulate my voice for effect. I didn't slow down at the difficult parts or speed through them. I kept the same pace throughout, because the facts stated plainly and in sequence carry their own weight without assistance. It was 6 months and the project collapsed. The main contractor withdrew. The financing structure failed in a sequence that happened faster than I could respond to. Partnership clauses. I had not fully understood, created exposure I couldn't recover from. The company filed for dissolution in November. 12 people needed to find other work. I was left with the debt. I paused for a moment, not for effect, but because what came next required its own sentence. My wife was in her 3rd trimester. No one at the table moved. Patricia, who had heard none of this before today, kept her expression professionally neutral, which I knew from 9 years of working with her was a deliberate act. Marcus had his hands folded on the table. He already knew the story. He was watching Edward. I spent years believing that what happened was the result of my own errors in judgment, and some of it was. I was 28. I made decisions I would make differently today. But what I didn't understand, what I had no way to understand at the time, was that the structure of that failure was not entirely accidental. Edward had not moved. He had not looked away. He sat across the table from me, with his hands folded in front of him, and the expression of a man receiving an accounting he has known at some level was outstanding for a long time. The land that project was built around was acquired at auction 8 months after my company dissolved. The acquiring entity had been incorporated 3 months before the project failed. That entity became the foundation of what is now registered as Hargrove Capital. The room was very quiet. I had said all of this without accusation, without the kind of language that turns a fact into an indictment. I had simply described a sequence of events in the order they occurred, and I had let the sequence speak for itself. This was deliberate. I had made a decision somewhere around midnight the previous evening that I was not going to walk into this room and perform anger. I had spent 30 years being angry in the ordinary background way that people are angry about things they can't resolve and can't fully set down. I was done performing it. Today I was just going to tell the truth and see what it produced. When I finished, the silence stretched for a long moment. Then Edward said, "I remember." 2 words, quiet, flat, without inflection. He wasn't offering an explanation. He wasn't mounting a defense. He was simply confirming that the account I had given was accurate, that this was not a misunderstanding or a conflation or a case of incomplete information on my part. He remembered. He had always remembered. He was saying with those 2 words that the debt had been on his books for 30 years, the same way it had been on mine. That was more than I had expected. I don't know exactly what I had expected, some version of a defense, perhaps some reframing of events to distribute the responsibility differently. What I received instead was confirmation, plain and quiet and without caveats. It sat in the room between us. Derek had said nothing throughout. I was peripherally aware of him the way you're aware of a variable you haven't yet needed to address, but haven't forgotten about. He was sitting with his hands on the table, and his expression had shifted somewhere in the middle of my account, from the prepared confidence of a man who knows his position to something considerably less settled. I don't know at precisely what point it had occurred to him that he was not the protagonist of what was happening in this room, that the history running across this table predated his involvement by decades and had nothing to do with his plan. But somewhere in the last several minutes, that understanding had arrived. He was looking at the table now. Marcus reached forward and placed the folder in the center of the table. He did it without ceremony, just set it down flat closed in the space between Edward and me. The folder was 3 inches thick. The tabs were color-coded. It was organized, comprehensive, and entirely silent about its own contents. "I owe you an apology," Edward said, "for what happened in 1994. He said it looking at me directly, not to the room, not to his attorneys, to me. I gave a single slow nod. "That is a beginning," I said, But there are things that have happened in the past several months that we also need to discuss. Actions taken under the name of your company. I moved the folder an inch closer to his side of the table. I want to understand what you knew and what you authorized. Edward looked at the folder. Then he looked at Derek. It was the first time he had looked directly at his son-in-law since sitting down. The look lasted only a moment. Brief contained the expression of a man whose understanding of a situation has just shifted in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Derek met the look for perhaps half a second before his gaze moved to a fixed point on the table in front of him. The folder sat between all of us, still closed. Edward opened the folder. He did it the way people open things when they're not sure what they'll find but have already decided they need to know steadily, without hesitation. Pulling back the cover and placing it flat to the left without looking up. He found the first tab section and began to read. Marcus started talking. His voice was the same as it always is. When he's presenting material, he's prepared, carefully measured, unhurried, precise. He doesn't editorialize. He doesn't emphasize. He moves through information the way a surveyor moves through land, methodically, with attention to the boundaries, letting the terrain speak for itself. The first item, he said, is a recorded communication from the 4th of January. An account representative at a construction supply firm received a call suggesting that Callahan Holdings was experiencing internal financial instability. The call originated from a number traced to a third-party communication service. The entity that contracted that service shares a registered address with a subsidiary of Hargrove Capital. He turned a page. Edward turned a page. The second item concerns the Chicago Winter Charitable Evening held on the 17th of January. The event's guest coordination team received a series of messages over a 4-day period beginning the 9th of January, indicating that Robert Callahan would not be attending and requesting that any formal acknowledgement be redirected. The messages were sent from an address not associated with this office or the Callahan Foundation. The IP routing traces to a network registered to an entity incorporated in Delaware. Another page. Edward's hand moved across the paper. I watched his face not because I was looking for a particular reaction, but because faces tell you things in moments like this that nothing else will, the small recalibrations, the expressions that come and go too quickly for anyone to have composed them deliberately. What I saw in Edward's face over the course of those pages was not shock exactly. It was the specific expression of a person who is discovering that something they hadn't known was happening had nonetheless been happening in their name, and who understands, with each additional page, exactly what that means, legally, professionally, and in ways that have nothing to do with either. Marcus continued. He laid out the North Chicago parcel. The title challenges the investor contacts the government affairs communications. He presented each element in sequence with documentation attached cross-reference to the relevant Hargrove Capital entity. He was thorough without being exhaustive. He covered everything that needed to be covered and stopped when the record was complete. Derek interrupted twice. The first time was somewhere around the third section, a short interjection, something about context and timing that began with, "What you have to understand is..." Marcus paused, waited until Derek finished, and then resumed from exactly where he had left off without acknowledging the interruption or adjusting his presentation in any way. As if the interjection had been weather notable briefly and then passed. The second attempt came near the end. It was shorter and less structured than the first, the verbal equivalent of reaching for something to hold on to and not finding it. Marcus waited again, resumed again, with the same even pace. When Marcus finished, he closed his own copy of the folder and placed it neatly in front of him. He said nothing further. He had said everything he needed to say. The room settled into a silence of a different quality than the ones that had come before it. Not the silence of anticipation or of waiting, but of a room in which a record has been read into existence and cannot be unread. Derek sat with his hands on the table. He had stopped looking at the folder somewhere during the second section and had not looked at it since. He was looking at the table itself, a fixed point. The way you look at something when you're not seeing it and don't want anyone to know that. Edward closed the folder. He placed his hand flat on top of it, the way you place your hand on something to confirm it's real. He stood. He didn't look at me. He looked at Derek. I didn't speak. There was nothing I needed to add to what Marcus had presented, and there was no version of what came next that would be improved by my participation in it. What happened between Edward and Derek in that moment was its own thing, and it was not mine to shape. Derek said something low, short the beginning of an account that didn't get far before Edward's expression stopped it. Then Derek spoke again, a little longer this time, with less structure and more of the quality that comes when a person has run out of framing and is left with the plain version of what they did. He confirmed each of the 3 actions. He confirmed that he had initiated them independently. He confirmed that no one at Hargrove Capital had knowledge of them at the level they were conducted. He confirmed it, not because he had decided to, and not out of any internal reckoning. With what he'd done, I could see clearly enough that no such reckoning was taking place. He confirmed it because the folder sitting closed under Edward's hand contained 31 documented actions, and the only question remaining was which version of the next hour he preferred. Edward sat back down. He looked across the table at me. His expression had settled into something quieter and older than what he'd walked in with the face of a man who has learned something he should have known and who understands, without anyone having said it directly what it has cost. I had no knowledge of this, he said. None of these actions were authorized. I will take responsibility for correcting every item in that record. I nodded once. I know you didn't, I said. That's why we're having this conversation here, instead of somewhere considerably less comfortable for everyone. A silence. 2 beats of it. Long enough for the statement to land without requiring a response. Then I looked at him steadily and let a moment pass before speaking again. There's one more thing that needs to be addressed, I said, and it has nothing to do with the folder. I held his gaze. My daughter, I said. Something shifted in Edward's face. Not quickly, it moved the way things move when a person absorbs an unexpected weight and adjusts their footing to accommodate it. He had come into this room prepared for a business confrontation. He had found something considerably more layered than that, and now another layer had arrived. He looked at me for a long moment, not with the expression of a man managing a crisis, but with the expression of a man who has passed through managing and arrived somewhere more honest. Tell me about Natalie, he said quietly. By 3 o'clock, the conference room had been cleared, and the building had settled back into its ordinary afternoon rhythm. Marcus had left with the legal team to begin the documentation process, the formal record of what had been confirmed, the steps that would need to follow. Edward and his attorneys had gone. Derek had gone without looking at me again, which was the right instinct, even if it had arrived for the wrong reasons. I was at my desk with my jacket over the back of the chair, and my tie loosened when my assistant knocked twice and opened the door a few inches. Her name was Claire. She'd been with the office for 4 years and had the particular quality of knowing when to deliver information quickly and without elaboration. "Mr. Callahan, your daughter is downstairs. She doesn't have an appointment," she said, a brief pause. "She said she'll wait however long it takes." I looked at the window for a moment. The February afternoon light was already beginning to thin. "It'd send her up," I said. Natalie came through the door the way people come through doors when they've made a decision and are committed to it before they arrive. She was wearing a heavy coat, dark wool, the kind that goes on in the morning, when you don't know how the day will end, and her hair was pulled back without much attention to it. She stopped just inside the door and looked at me across the office. Her eyes were the particular red that comes not from recent emotion, but from emotion that has been going on for a long time and has worked its way into the infrastructure. I didn't say anything. I gestured to the chair across from the desk, the same chair that Edward had sat in for a different kind of conversation a few hours earlier. She crossed the room and sat down. She put her bag on the floor, placed her hands on her knees, and looked at the surface of the desk between us. I waited. This was not difficult. I have learned over many years and in many different rooms that silence offered to someone who needs to speak is one of the more useful things you can give them. It doesn't require anything. It just stays open. She started talking without looking up. The first year, she said, everything was fine. I don't mean that in the way people say it when they're making excuses for something. I mean that if you had asked me, I would have told you the truth, as I understood it, which was that things were fine. She moved one hand from her knee to the arm of the chair. A small adjustment, a kind of anchoring. It wasn't he never raised his voice. He never said anything directly wrong. It was more like she stopped, started again. There were phrases he used, repeated. Not often enough that you'd notice a pattern right away, but often enough that they started to feel like things I believed rather than things he'd said. She looked up then briefly, then back at her hands. He used to say, "Your dad seems happier in his own world, Nat. He's probably more comfortable there." And it always sounded like he was looking out for you. Like he was protecting you from situations where you might feel out of place. Like including you less was actually the considerate thing to do. I kept my hands still on the desk. I kept my face neutral. Not because I felt neutral. I was aware of something in my chest that had the specific weight of understanding arriving too late, but because this was her account to give. And the shape of it needed to come from her, not from my reactions to it. "He never said you were wrong about anything," she continued. "He never said anything bad. He placed you somewhere. And then, every time I went to reach toward that place, there was always a reason why it wasn't the right moment. A conflict, a consideration, something that made the gap feel reasonable." She pressed her lips together, looked at the window. "The Christmas call," she said. "That was mine. That decision was mine, Dad. I want you to know that I'm not saying I had no part in it. He suggested it. But I made the call. I dialed the number." She looked at me directly for the first time since sitting down. "He never told me you were less than. He just made me feel it until I thought I'd concluded it myself." The office was quiet, somewhere below. The building continued its ordinary late afternoon business. The low sounds of an organization that had 847 people moving through their work without any awareness of what was happening on the 42nd floor. I did not speak. Not yet. There was more. I could see it in the way she was sitting, the way her hands had stilled, and I was not going to close the space before she was finished. I heard things over the last few months, fragments of conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. I didn't understand all of it. I still don't. But I understood enough to know that something was happening that involved you, and that Derek knew what it was. And I didn't ask him directly because I already knew. A pause. I already knew that whatever he told me wouldn't be the whole truth. She looked at her hands again. "I texted you last night because I was scared," she said very quietly. "Not for the meeting, for you. And I didn't know how to say that without saying everything else, so I just said, the small version. The small version." 3 words, and she'd sent them at 10 o'clock on a February night, and I'd replied with 3 words of my own, and both of us had said considerably more than the words we used. I waited another moment. She didn't add anything further. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Are you safe, Natalie?" She looked up. Her mouth moved the beginning of an answer. She gave a single nod. Then something in it shifted and she shook her head. Slowly. She looked down at her hands opened in her lap. And she stayed there for a moment, looking at them as though checking whether they belonged to her. "I don't know," she said. "I'm not sure I know what that looks like right now." I stood up. The rooftop access door opened onto a narrow ledge that wrapped around the mechanical equipment housing on the 43rd floor. It wasn't a terrace in any design sense. No furniture, no lighting beyond the ambient glow of the city below. Just a flat surface and a railing and a view that extended to the lake on clear days and to a gray middle distance on days like this one. I'd been up here a handful of times over the years, mostly during the first months after we moved into the building, when I needed to think through something that the office walls were making harder to think through. Natalie followed me up without asking where we were going. That, too, was something sure had inherited from her mother, the willingness to follow a direction before understanding it, based on something other than information. The cold came through immediately. Chicago. In February at this elevation is unambiguous. The wind off the lake moves through you, rather than around you. And the sky in the late afternoon had settled into the particular gray that comes just before the light begins to go. We stood at the railing and looked out. The city spread below us, the grid of it, the buildings and the gaps between them, the dark ribbon of the river turning west somewhere below. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then I started talking. In October of 1994, I said I had $11 in a checking account, not 1,100, 11, The company was dissolved. The debt was restructured into a payment arrangement that was going to take 4 years to work through, and your mother was in her 3rd trimester. Natalie was looking out at the city. She didn't turn. We'd moved everything we could afford to move into a 2-room office in a building on the south side, the same block as the house, actually. The rent was $300 a month, which I could cover, because the building owner owed me a favor from a job I'd done the year before. Your mother slept on a second-hand couch we bought at a thrift store 3 blocks away. When she was too far along to sleep comfortably on it, we put a camping mat underneath. She didn't complain about it. She did say once that it was the most interesting piece of furniture she'd ever owned. Something in Natalie's posture shifted a small release somewhere in the shoulders. You used to sleep there too when you were very small. I'd bring you in on nights when I was working late and your mother was tired, and I'd put you in the corner of the couch with a folded jacket as a bumper and work at the desk until 2 or 3 in the morning. You slept through almost everything. You've always been able to do that, find your way to sleep in the middle of whatever's happening. I paused. The wind came through in a long, steady push off the lake, and both of us leaned slightly into it without moving our feet. I never told you any of that. I said because I didn't want you to carry the weight of it. It was my history, my difficulty, and I thought the kindest thing I could do was keep it separate from yours, give you a stable surface and let you build on it without knowing about the foundations. I looked at the lake barely visible now, a dark presence beyond the city's edge. What I actually did was make myself a stranger to you. I gave you the surface and kept everything that made me real to myself. And a person you don't fully know is a person you can't fully trust, even when you want to, even when you're trying to. Natalie turned her head toward me. I could see her in my peripheral vision. I kept looking at the lake. I'm not telling you this so that you'll feel sorry for me, or so that the weight of what I didn't share becomes yours to manage now. I'm telling you because you came up here, you came to the office, you waited, you sat down and told me the truth, and you deserve the same back. A long pause. The city moved below us the way it always does, without regard to what's happening on any particular floor of any particular building. I'm not angry at you, Natalie. She made a small sound, not quite a word. I want to be clear about that, I said. I'm not. I considered the right word. Sad is the better one. There's a difference between them that matters. Anger is about what happened. Sadness is about what something means. I'm sad because the distance between us wasn't inevitable. It was built piece by piece over years, and some of those pieces were mine to put down, and I didn't. We stood there for a moment with that between us. Then Natalie said, "Why didn't you confront Derek when you found out what he was doing?" It was a fair question, precise and fair, and the kind that deserved an honest answer. Because I didn't want to put you in the middle of it, I said. I didn't want you to feel like you had to choose a position before you had all the information you needed to make that choice for yourself. She was quiet for a moment. That was your mistake, she said. Not unkindly, just directly. The same way she used to tell me when she was 9 years old and I'd given her a factually incorrect answer to something she'd looked up that I'd gotten it wrong. Matter of fact, unbothered by the fact that she was correcting me. Yes, I said, it was. I didn't explain it further or qualify it. It was true, and she'd named it correctly, and the right response to that was to agree and not complicate it. She turned back toward the city. We stood for another minute without talking, and the silence was different from the ones we'd been in all day. Not the silence of waiting, or of processing, or of rooms where things were being decided. Just 2 people standing in the cold in the same place at the same time. Nothing being asked of it. Then she turned to face me. "Can we fix this, Dad?" The wind picked up off the lake and moved through the space between us. I looked at the water in the distance dark, now the surface of it indistinguishable from the horizon, the whole of it one continuous gray that went on past where I could see. I didn't answer right away. The answer existed. I knew what it was, and I knew how I wanted to give it to her. Not standing on a rooftop in the February cold. In writing the next morning in my own hand on paper that she could hold and keep and return to. Some answers need to be said out loud, and some need to be written down, and I had learned over 58 years to know the difference. "Come inside," I said. "It's too cold to stay up here." I held the door, and she walked through it, and I followed. And behind us, the city continued in the ordinary way of cities indifferent to individuals, faithful to the whole. I arrived at the office at 6:15, which was earlier than my usual time, and later than Marcus, who was already at the conference table with 2 cups of coffee and the contract documentation, arranged in 2 identical sets, one for each side of the table. He had paper-clipped the signature pages to the top of each stack and set a pen beside each one. He didn't say good morning. He slid one of the coffees across the table toward me and opened his own copy to the first page. That was all that needed to happen between us. I drank the coffee and read through the contract once. Though I had reviewed it 3 times the day before, and Marcus had reviewed it twice, and Patricia had reviewed it once, and every material point was already known to me. Reading it again was not about the content. It was about giving myself the full measure of the morning before Edward arrived. He came at 8 o'clock exactly. He came alone. No attorneys, no associates, no one carrying documents or managing the logistics of his presence. Just Edward Hargrove in a coat and a plain suit, carrying nothing but a single folder that turned out to contain his own copy of the contract already reviewed and tabbed. He set it on the table, took the seat across from me, and accepted the coffee Marcus offered without comment. We didn't open with pleasantries. There wasn't a version of small talk that fit the situation, and neither of us attempted one. I appreciated that. "The land matter," Edward said. "My team will have the withdrawals filed and processed by end of week, full withdrawal, and there will be appropriate compensation for the disruption to your development timeline. I'll have Patricia coordinate with your office on the specifics," I said. He nodded. That was the end of it as far as that went. We signed the contract in a straightforward sequence, Marcus witnessing on my side, Edward's sole assistant, who had waited in the lobby and been brought up for the purpose, witnessing on his. It took 11 minutes. The practical terms were simple: a structured partnership on 2 commercial development projects over the next 4 years with defined roles, defined returns, and clearly delineated decision-making authority. No ambiguity. No provisions that could be read 2 ways. When I set down the pen, I looked at the signed document for a moment before Marcus collected it. I said, "This agreement has nothing to do with you and me, Edward. It has nothing to do with what happened 30 years ago or with anything that happened in the last several months." He met my eyes. 847 people come to work every morning. I said, "Because they believe in what this company is building. The North Chicago project is 400 units of housing for families who need it. That's why I'm sitting at this table. Not for you, not against you, for them." Edward held the look for a moment. He gave a single slow nod, the kind that carries more weight than any verbal response. Marcus began organizing the signed documents into their respective folders. The meeting was functionally complete. Edward stood, buttoned his jacket, picked up his folder. He shook my hand, a clean handshake, brief and level. Then he turned toward the door. He stopped at the threshold. "I spent 30 years becoming a particular kind of man, Robert," he said without turning around. "Not a kind I'd recommend. Don't let your daughter spend her years becoming the version of herself that someone else decided she should be." He walked out. The door closed behind him, with the ordinary sound of a door closing, which is how most significant moments end, not with punctuation, just the next ordinary sound following the last. Marcus and I sat in the quiet for a moment. Then he gathered the remaining folders and left to begin the filing process, and I sat alone at the conference table with my coffee and the February morning outside the window, and I let the room be still. By 2 o'clock I was on the south side. The house looked the same as it always does. Same shutters, same gate, same crack in the sidewalk that Natalie used to hop over with both feet. The garden was still bare, the perennials Margaret had planted, pressing up under a thin crust of remaining frost, waiting for a season that hadn't arrived yet. I sat on the porch step with my coat on and reached into my inside pocket for the notepad page I'd folded and kept there since the previous morning. I unfolded it on my knee. What I had written the night before the meeting was a beginning, rough compressed. The kind of writing you do at midnight when you're trying to get something from inside your head onto paper before it changes shape. I read through it once. Then I took out a pen and kept going from where I'd left off, filling the rest of the page, and then a second page I'd brought folded inside it. I wrote until the thing was complete, until I'd said what needed to be said in the right order, with nothing important left out and nothing included that was there for the wrong reasons. When I finished, I read it through from the beginning. I made 2 small corrections. Then I folded the pages carefully twice precisely and placed them in the envelope I'd brought from the office. I wrote Natalie's name on the front in the kind of deliberate hand that means you're paying attention to each letter as you make it. I held the envelope for a moment, then set it on my knee. From the same inside pocket, I took out the other envelope. It was yellowed now, the paper softened by decades of being kept and moved and kept again. The handwriting on the front was Margaret's my name in her careful script, with the date written beneath it in smaller letters. 2001. I had opened it once 23 years ago, on a February morning in that same office building, and I had read it through once and then folded it back and placed it in the envelope and carried it forward without opening it again. Not because I was afraid of what it said, because I hadn't been ready to receive it fully, and I had known that at the time, and I had made a decision to wait. I opened it now. The paper had the particular texture of old things kept with care, thin, dry, holding its folds precisely. Her handwriting was the same as I remembered it, the same as it was in the photograph from 1993, the same as it had been across every letter and note and grocery list she had ever left on the kitchen counter, consistent, entirely hers. I read it through to the end. When I finished, I sat with it in my hands for a long time. The garden in front of me was very still. No cardinal today. Just the bare stems and the frost and the particular quiet of a place where something that mattered had once grown and would grow again. I folded the letter back into its original creases carefully along the existing lines, the way you fold something you intend to keep. I put it back in its envelope. I held it in both hands. And then, for the first time in 22 years, I let myself sit with what it had cost, all of it. The 30 years, and the silence, and the distance, and the $11 in the checking account, and the second-hand couch, and the nights working until 3 while a child slept in the corner, and what it had produced and what it had not produced, and what might still be possible. I did not make a sound. I simply sat in the garden that Margaret had planted, because she wanted things that came back on their own, and I let what was true be true, and the winter held its quiet around me. When I stood up, I put both envelopes in my coat pocket, one to send, one to keep. I walked back to the truck. A year is a long time, and no time at all, depending on what you're measuring. The office looked the way it always does in December. The string lights that Claire had wound around the windows sometime in the first week of the month. The small tree on the reception desk that Marcus had ordered from the same florist on the corner of Wabash every year for 20 years without variation. He claimed it was because the tree was a reliable size, and the florist gave us a good rate. I had long suspected it was because consistency in small things was one of the ways Marcus maintained order in a world that didn't always cooperate. Both things could be true. The team had gathered in the main floor space, which we cleared on the last working Friday before the holiday each year, the table pushed back. The chairs arranged in the loose configuration of people who were comfortable enough with each other not to need formal seating. There was food from the Italian place 2 blocks over that Patricia had been ordering from since her first year with us. And there was the particular noise of a room full of people who spend most of their time in focused work, suddenly permitted to be simply present with each other. 847 people, and a fair portion of them were here tonight. I moved through the room the way I always do at these gatherings, not anchored to any one conversation, not performing a circuit, just present, stopping when something warranted stopping for, listening when listening was what was needed. I've been doing this long enough to know that the thing people remember from these evenings isn't what was said at the podium. It's the 30-second conversation by the food table where someone felt like they had been actually seen. The year had moved the way years do, when they contain significant things, not quickly, not slowly, but with a particular texture that you notice only in retrospect. In March, Marcus had finalized the documentation on the Hargrove matter, the legal withdrawals, the compensation filing, the partnership agreement processing through its initial stages. The North Chicago project had resumed its timeline in April, 2 months behind the original schedule, which was recoverable. The foundation work was underway. In April, Natalie had called and asked if I wanted to get coffee. We had met at a place near her apartment, a small corner cafe, not the kind of place you go to be seen the kind you go to, because the coffee is good and the tables are the right distance apart. We had sat for an hour and a half. We had not resolved anything. We had talked about ordinary things, a book she'd been reading, a neighborhood I was considering for a smaller project, the way the city looked different in spring than in any other season. At the end, she had said, "Same time next month," and I had said yes, and then we had both understood that the question hadn't really been about coffee. She had ended the marriage in June. I knew this because she had told me directly in a text message that was brief and factual, and that asked for nothing in response except acknowledgement. I had replied with 4 words, "I'm here if needed." She had sent back a single word that meant she had understood. In September, we had dinner. A proper dinner at a restaurant. She chose where we sat for 2 hours and talked about things that were closer to the real things, her work, which she'd redirected towards something she'd been putting off for years. My work, which I described more fully than I had in a long time, the Southside House, which I told her I still owned and still visited, and which she said she'd like to see again someday when it felt right. Someday when it felt right. That was where we were, which was further than we had been and not as far as we would get, and the right pace for the distance we were actually covering. Marcus found me near the windows around 8 o'clock. He was holding 2 glasses, one of which he extended in my direction, and wearing the expression of a man who has something he wants to say and has been waiting for the right moment. "If I could have everyone's attention for approximately 45 seconds, he said, addressing the room without raising his voice much. Because 45 years of managing rooms had taught him that you don't need volume if you have presence. The room settled. "I've worked for this company for 15 years, he said, "which means I've watched it be built from a version of itself that occupied half this floor into whatever it currently is. Which is considerably more complicated to explain at parties." A small laugh from the room. "I've watched it make decisions that prioritize people over margins on more than one occasion, in more than one context, and I've watched those decisions turn out to be correct." He turned toward me briefly. To the man who figured out early on that the difference between a building and a place where people actually live is whether someone cared enough to get the details right, and who has been getting the details right for 30 years. He lifted his glass. The details. The room echoed it back, the details in the loose, warm way of people who meant it without needing to perform it. I lifted my glass. I looked around the room at the faces that had become over years, and through the ordinary accumulation of shared work, something closer to a chosen community than an organizational chart. These were people who knew what we were building. They had not needed to know my net worth to decide whether to give the work their full effort. They had not needed the Forbes cover or the 42nd floor or any of the external measurements to determine whether this was a place worth showing up to every day. They had decided that on their own terms. I stepped out to the balcony. The city was doing what it does in December. The lights, the movement, the particular density of a place that contains millions of people all navigating their own version of the season. The snow had started sometime in the last hour, the small, steady kind that doesn't announce itself, just arrives and continues. My phone buzzed. Natalie. "Merry Christmas, Dad." Her voice was different from a year ago in the way that mattered most. Not studied, not compressed into the shape of something safe. Just her voice in its ordinary register, without the slight careful quality that had been there for longer than I'd let myself fully notice. "Merry Christmas," I said. A moment of quiet, comfortable, not empty. "I read the letter again this morning," she said. "Your letter. Take your time with it," I said. "I am," she said. "I'm trying to." "I know," I said. "I can tell." Another pause. The snow fell on the city below us, or at least on my portion of it, 14 floors up, which was the only portion I could speak for. "Merry Christmas, Natalie." "Merry Christmas, Dad." The call ended. I held the phone for a moment, then put it in my pocket. Behind me, the balcony door opened. "The food is getting cold," Marcus said, "and I have told that particular joke 3 times in 3 consecutive years, which means it has officially become a tradition, which means I'm now obligated to continue whether or not it gets funnier." I turned around. The smile came without deciding to smile, which is the only kind that counts. Not the expression I use in conference rooms when I need to signal something, and not the one that means I know something the other person doesn't. Just a smile, uncomplicated, the kind that happens when you're standing in the right place at the right time, and you know it. "Then let's go in," I said. Marcus held the door. I walked through it. The warmth of the room came back around me. The voices, the lights, the particular sound of people who had decided on their own terms to be somewhere together. The balcony door closed behind us. Outside, the snow continued falling on Chicago in the patient, indifferent, faithful way that snow falls on cities covering the old and the new alike, making no distinctions, asking nothing, simply arriving and staying for as long as it stays. If there's one thing I want you to take from this family story, it's this: silence is not the same as strength. I told myself for decades that keeping quiet was a form of protection, protecting Natalie from the weight of my past, protecting myself from having to explain who I was before I became who I am. What I actually did was make myself a stranger to my own daughter. And a stranger, no matter how wealthy or how respected, is still a stranger. Don't do what I did. Don't wait until a family betrayal forces your hand before you decide to be honest with the people you love. Don't convince yourself that withholding your story is a gift. It isn't. It's a distance you're choosing to keep, and distance held long enough becomes the default. Natalie didn't grow apart from me because she stopped caring. She grew apart from me because I never gave her enough of the real me to hold on to. I've lived long enough to know that family betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes wrapped in the language of concern, spoken quietly, repeated often enough that the people closest to you begin to mistake it for their own conclusions. Derek never raised his voice. He never told Natalie a single dramatic lie. He simply repositioned the truth inch by inch until she was standing somewhere she didn't recognize and didn't know how she'd gotten there. That is the kind of family betrayal that leaves no fingerprints and the kind that does the most lasting damage. What saved this family story, if anything did, was not strategy. It was not the folder Marcus prepared, or the meeting in the boardroom, or the contract Edward signed. It was two people standing on a rooftop in the February cold, finally saying true things to each other after years of saying careful ones. I'm not a religious man in the conventional sense, but I do believe, and I think God places certain people in our lives not to make things easier, but to show us where we've been looking away. Margaret was that for me, and losing her taught me too slowly that the people still here deserve more than what I was giving. This is my family story. I'm not proud of all of it, but I can account for it, and that I've come to believe is the most honest thing any of us can offer. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. If this story stirred something in, you drop a comment below. What would you have done differently in Robert's position? I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective. If this kind of storytelling resonates with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. A quick note: while this story draws from real human experiences and social themes, certain elements have been dramatized for narrative purposes. If this style of content isn't your cup of tea, no hard feelings, there's plenty more to explore.